we are going to build out your toolbox with 6 proven techniques that have been used in the continuous improvement space, Lean, Six Sigma, and starting to really think through how would we use this in our own organization. We are going to talk about runners, repeaters, and strangers. Now, you're probably already wondering, this sounds a little bit odd. And it's going to get a little bit more odd, but please bear with me because I promise that it is going somewhere and it really will help you. I think the easiest way to make it a little bit more concrete is to think of a facility approval application. Well, if we were to think of the runner, repeater, stranger concept, there's going to be a large number of these types of applications that are routine, checklist, and then you're going to have some that are almost the extreme opposite. Your repeaters are somewhere in between. One of the challenges people face is when they think of designing a process or documenting the way we're supposed to do things, we tend to approach those exercises from a one-size-fits-all. What you run a really big risk of is what a lot of people do inadvertently. So you either take the approach of saying, you know what, we had a hearing, we had an application that was so contentious, and we decided to dissect it, and we came up with a checklist of 20,000 things that need to be verified, documents that need to be included. You really take the one-offs, the unique situations, and you over-engineer the process. Or similarly, you create a streamlined process for your runners, but you forget that your repeaters happen often enough that they as well could benefit from having kind of a customized type of process for files that are fitting that type of characteristic. So I think you can really simplify runner, repeater, stranger as this concept of one size does not fit all. All right, I have a bit of a pop quiz for you. Can you tell me who is this guy? I'll give you a few clues to help you along. He's from Italy. His first name is Wilfred, and he was asked to study crimes. Any guesses? Okay, I'll tell you a little bit more about him before I reveal who he actually is. He was actually asked to study patterns in crimes. And what he found is that if you looked at a population of 100 people, and say that population had 100 crimes, you found that 80% of the population wasn't really committing hardly any crimes at all. the crimes were being committed by a very small pocket of the population. So many of you probably now have a pretty good guess of who this individual is. He is Wilfred Pareto, and he's largely credited with who we have attributed the 80-20 principle to. Now, I can bet that most of you have heard of the 80-20 principle, right? So it's not a new principle, it's a very common principle. But have you actually taken pen to paper and tried to apply that principle to your work? Applied it to the applications that you're responsible for? Here's kind of a few ideas just to get you to start thinking about it. One approach could be to take the revenue requirement, what are all the drivers and all of the components that come into it to be able to focus on the biggest dollar amount, and then taking those components and actually breaking them out into two separate streams. A stream that is run-of-the-mill, has been vetted before and is kind of routine, business as usual, and a segment in there that is truly new, novel, different. It's called a start-stop, and as the name implies, it's a very simple exercise that you go through and identify the activities that you and your organization would benefit from starting to do, as well as the activities that you believe you need to stop doing. It's a really easy way to solicit feedback from people across all different functional areas, across all different levels in the organization, as well as branching outside the confines of your specific organization to ask some of the stakeholder groups and internal and external customer groups that you engage with to get their feedback on some of this as well. But there's a few caveats. So like anything, the devil is in the details. And if you want to get really good feedback and really good responses out of this exercise, you need to set people up with the right context and the right preamble. What you don't want to have happen is for people to say, oh, that department over there, they need to stop doing so many waste of time meetings, and oh, those people over there, they need to start doing more analysis. That's great and probably true at the highest level, but to really be able to do something meaningful with the information, you're going to need a slightly different type of response. So whenever you're tackling the start-stop exercise, I think it's really helpful to imagine a 2x2 diagram. So what you want to be thinking about along the bottom axis is the time horizon. Are you trying to engage feedback from individuals in terms of what they think they should start doing over the next 1 to 3 months, over the next 3 to 5 years, or long-term strategic things over 10 plus years? The time horizon that you ask for people's input in is going to make a huge difference in terms of the feedback, the suggestions, the ideas, really the context of what people are going to have in their mind in answering those questions. Good news is you actually don't have to choose just one. You can set it up in a way that you're asking people to think about those different time horizons and to provide content on what they believe the organization should start doing across different time periods. The other axis that you're going to want to consider is sphere of influence. So, as I was mentioning before, you don't want people to just say, hey, this is what everyone else needs to do differently, but me, myself, in my little bubble, everything is perfect. There's nothing that I need to change. So you want to get people to kind of think across different levels, across what is in their immediate control and their sole ability to influence and to change, what might interact with and kind of bump up across other stakeholders, other departments, other areas that you may need to engage with. And then at the very top, maybe even things that have to change outside of even your own organization's context and boundaries. Usually the higher up that scale you go, the bigger the potential impact that those changes can have, but also it can sometimes be the harder ones to implement. The other thing that you want to make sure is nuanced whenever you go through this type of exercise. There's usually a scale, and this really comes out when you look at the stop activities. Because at the very, very end of the spectrum, you have activities that you stop, and somewhere along the spectrum, you have activities that you may continue to do, but do less frequently, or do in a different way without eliminating altogether. So what you want to be really cautious of is if you're saying, just stop reviewing any of the decisions before they get published, or, stop doing any QA, quality assurance reviews before we put anything on the record. Probably not something that you're going to want to do. But whenever you go a layer deeper into a particular review process, you might find that there are some areas where there's some duplication. There could be the same review and the same cross-checking of numbers is happening by different people in different areas. So you really want to be nuanced when you're looking at what needs to stop. And you really want to make sure that what comes out of those stop activities really get broken down one layer further so that they can truly be actioned and truly be implemented. One of the other words of advice I would offer if you are going to kind of on a more broader scale conduct a start-stop exercise is going to be to actually ask people, as part of what they're saying needs to stop doing, ask them to specifically identify the barriers. Because the reality is, most of us, if there's something that we could have stopped doing that was solely within our control, we would have, right? No one really wants to be doing an activity that they don't really think is the most valuable. People really want to spend their time where it makes the biggest difference and where it makes the biggest impact. If you can overcome them, you'll find that it really frees you up to go after what's usually a long list of things that everyone wants to start doing. And that's the work that's really energizing, and that gets people really engaged. And the reality is most of us want to be highly engaged in our roles, and we want to work with other people that are highly engaged. So spend the time to tackle those really, really hard things on this stop list so that you can free up your team, your time to go after the really, really big prizes on the start side of things. So this tool is called Tim Woods. I know it seems a little unusual, but it's a really good memory jogger, a really good trick to remind yourself of the different categories of inefficiency. So this tool and this technique is really about being systematic in looking through our processes, everything we do, and just kind of trying to identify every single inefficiency that we can, and then just start hammering them one by one in order of priority, in order of what's the most important to you. But it's a really good tool to think comprehensively about inefficiencies and really to pick up on things that might be more subtle that you maybe weren't really thinking of as an inefficiency that really might be causing more drag on your process than you necessarily realized. As we go through each of these letters, remind yourself that these are manufacturing concepts. So they may not fit perfectly for a regulated company. That's okay. That's all right. Really what's more important is the thought process of being systematic going through it. So let's start with T. T is transportation. So you can imagine a manufacturing company, you would have inputs in one part of the world, you assemble a part here, and then you transport it and ship it there. Of course, you want to minimize transportation. So how would that actually apply to a utility or a utility commission? Well, actually, one of the areas in most applications are very, very heavy in financial schedules, in tables. There's some in the narrative in the Word document, there's some attached in Excel. But I'm willing to bet some of your analysts have to go through a process of copying and pasting, of consolidating it all together, maybe fixing up some of the formulas because the links were removed whenever it got submitted. So all of that is actually transportation, and you could consider that to be a form of inefficiency if we aren't able to make those upstream process changes to influence the way that the information is coming into us. The next is inventory. And again, you can really physically see it whenever you're talking about inventory for a manufacturing company. But what would that look like if you were considering yourself in a utility space? Well, one area that I think of for inventory is just the sheer scope and number of files. Because whether a file is for $100 or $100 million, there's certain amounts of work that have to happen for it regardless. So to the extent that you can manage your overall mandate without having to have a huge number of files, meaning a consolidation of files, there's an opportunity for inventory efficiencies. So if you were able to make a really important regulation on covering a 5-year span versus a 1 or 2 year span, you get the idea. M is for motion. And picture yourself on a factory floor and you have to reach up for this part and reach down for that part and over here. Of course, you want to minimize motion, right? Because that just gets tiring. So how do you minimize that for a utility? Or does it even apply? Well, it certainly does apply, because if you imagine that you're trying to put together a comprehensive picture of a particular issue, you're going to want to know and be able to navigate across a whole series of different tabs, right? What did intervener group A say? Intervener group B? What did the commission staff say? What did this other utility say? What was in here? What was in there? You're really having to navigate and flip back and forth. And that's a form of motion, right? Because you're looking at all of these different areas. So that's a really tricky one to be able to resolve and to address, but even just being aware of it and trying to think through how can I minimize the extent of motion that goes into it. W stands for waiting, and that one is pretty intuitive, right? There's going to be breaks within the process where you need to pause and wait for IRs. Maybe you need to pause. There's a natural schedule that ends up happening. And that's okay. You don't necessarily need, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's really just about thinking of your overall workflow and how do you optimize, knowing that there's going to be periods of time where there is natural waiting that's occurring across different files. So just kind of about thinking through your workflow to know that waiting is going to be a reality. The next two I'd like to think of together, so overprocessing and overproduction. And I think of them as kind of on a continuum of quantity and quality, but the example I would give is everyone knows that we really, really care about a utility commission issuing very transparent, clear decisions. Overproduction would be thinking that a larger quantity of pages equals more transparency. So if you can convey in a very concise way in 10 pages instead of 100, perfect. That would be an idea of overproduction. And then overprocessing is on a very similar vein. But if the question was, how much did utility XYZ spend on, let's call it facilities? And someone goes to the trouble of answering and saying $10,937.15.22, when actually the level of precision that you cared about was about roughly ballpark 10 million. So you really want to think through what's that level of precision, because there's time and effort that goes into making something more precise than what the person asking for it actually ends up needing. Defects. This one we all know, we all hate. I think we've all been there where you had to get input of information from some other group, some other department, some other organization. You started working through your own processes only to find that there was an error in someone else's. And that causes you to basically have wasted all your time on that, have to go back and start over. So defects, bad, inefficiency, minimize them where you can, or at least be aware of the impact that they're having on your own processes. And then the last one is S for skills. And this is about matching the task with the right person to perform the task. So really, what's the complexity of the task? Who should be doing that type of work, and what skills do they need? So for example, a PhD in economics, and they're spending their time, doing very clerical type of work. So that is a quick overview of Tim Woods. Again, the idea and what's important with it is to really think through very systematically, what are the areas of inefficiency in my organization, in my processes, and then start attacking them one by one. Make your way down that list and just be ruthless in finding ways to eliminate them. All right, so imagine for a minute that we actually don't work for rate-regulated utilities or for a commission, and let's pretend that we actually live in the manufacturing world. So we have great big factories and we have equipment, and we are very, very careful about looking after this equipment. It comes with procedures, manuals, regular upkeep. As a knowledge worker, your main equipment is your brain, right? You are working all the time by taking inputs of information all around you, processing it in your mind, processing it using different criteria, using different analysis, different techniques, and your output ends up being the work products and the actual deliverables. The problem is your brain doesn't actually come with a procedure, manual, and the regular upkeep that reminds you to do all the things that you should be doing. What I really want you to think about with this tool is to treat your brain at least as well as you would treat a machine. In fact, you should probably treat it quite a lot better than a machine because it's the one and only that you have. Okay, so let's talk about some of the more tangible techniques you can use to put this concept into practice. First, there is reminding yourself that your brain is a physical part of your body. So you know it, stretching, movement, drinking water, getting enough sleep, all of those things actually will make a difference in terms of the analysis and the work that you are truly doing. One technique is called the Pomodoro Technique, and it comes from those old kitchen timers you've probably seen. It's become a really popular concept, but you basically just set a 25-minute timer. You can use it on your phone, you can set a timer on your computer, and in those 25 minutes, you focus specifically on one task. Now, after that 25 minutes, you might have to move on to something else or some other competing priority. But what's really important is 25 minutes of dedicated time, single focused on a particular task is going to make so much more difference than flittering from one email to the next, to a schedule, to something else, to a distraction, to this, to that. So the idea is to really batch your work into these 25-minute increments as a way of getting around the tendency we have to multitask and some of the drag that comes along with that. The last thing I would say about, treating your brain at least as well as a machine is the importance of reflection. How do you reflect whenever you are being bombarded with different requests all the time? You always have more to do than what you can actually get done. It sometimes feels like it's more urgent work rather than having time to really work on the important strategic priorities. So you have to think about how you're going to carve out your own time for reflection. And maybe that'll look different for different people, but actually putting yourself in nature can really stimulate your brain in quite surprising ways. All right, do you recognize this word? It's called poke-yoke, and essentially it translates to this idea of making something mistake-proof, making it foolproof, making it kid-safe, essentially. So it's about designing things to prevent errors up front rather than detecting them further down the line. So if you imagine the last time you went to fill your car up for gas, for example, did you see a spill of gasoline all over the pavement? Probably not, right? Because the design is what we would consider a poke-yoke design. An example that would apply a little bit more in an office type environment is a drop-down menu. So instead of having a free-form field of text where people can put any kind of response they want, any different characters, a drop-down really limits what the options are. So it says, hey, you can't input this incorrectly at the very beginning. It is about catching, preventing, controlling, stopping errors early on in the chain when they're little, when they're easy to fix, rather than later on in the process and trying to do rework or capturing any of the defects at that point in time. So let's think about a typical lessons learned exercise. So one, I'm going to assume you do lessons learned exercises at the end of your cases, your files, your projects. If you don't, it is a good exercise to go through and just kind of cycle back and say what went well, what didn't go well. And not to knock lessons learned, but I think that there's a tool that is far more effective than a lessons learned because it's called a pre-mortem. What could go wrong? So let's take the example of your portfolio of cases and of utilities that you regulate. You miss what your KPI or what your target was for getting those decisions issued on time. What could have contributed to this? What caused it to go wrong before it's actually happened? So you might do an exercise like this in June if you have a December year end and you kind of say, what could cause us to miss this particular target? What are the roadblocks we might face? What are the challenges? What are going to be the issues? And you end up tackling them up front. And even if you do nothing more than just spend 30 minutes whiteboarding what these ideas are, everyone will subconsciously keep that exercise with them as they proceed over the coming weeks and months, and they will be able to act and intervene and will feel far more empowered to bring up things even if they aren't specifically in their sandbox.